It is often hard to assess one's own pronunciation when learning Mandarin. People around you might understand what you're saying, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your tones are great. Simply asking people if your pronunciation is good won't work either, because they will often tell you that your pronunciation is good, even if it is not. So how can you figure out how good your pronunciation really is? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to share with you an ingenious method for figuring out how good your pronunciation really is. And this method is completely free to use, but you do need the help of a friendly native speaker, although not necessarily a professional. So we all know that learning pronunciation can require some time and effort, of course. Mastering all the tones and the sounds in Mandarin isn't very easy. But there are actually other problems that I kind of hinted at, because just figuring out what your problems actually are isn't as easy as it should be. And if you haven't studied languages, and particularly maybe if you haven't learned Chinese for a while, you might not be aware that this is indeed a problem. But you can't really trust people to just tell you how good your pronunciation is. So if you simply ask someone, how good is my pronunciation, they will usually tell you that it's quite good or great. And most of the time they say this as encouragement, not as a statement of fact. And in the case that they actually do mean that they think that your pronunciation is good, they are comparing you to other foreigners that they might have met, which probably doesn't mean much because the average foreigner's pronunciation is pretty bad, and I'm not sure how flattered you should be by being slightly better than the average. You can't necessarily know how good your pronunciation is based on feedback from your teacher either, because they are also comparing with your classmates and other students, and they usually don't have the time and energy to spend on pronunciation beyond the first few weeks of a beginner course. So it's quite common to hear students with atrocious pronunciation even in advanced classes, and they seldom get corrected. So the fact that your teacher has stopped correcting your pronunciation does not mean that there is nothing to correct. The most reliable way to get feedback from people around you is simply to see, do they understand what I'm saying? And if they do understand what you're saying, your pronunciation is probably okay, but it also depends on the context, because as we discussed in episode 45, the importance of accurate pronunciation depends on the kind of sentence you're saying. If it is high in context and people can figure out what you mean, even if your pronunciation is really bad, them understanding what you're saying doesn't really say much about your pronunciation. It just means that the context was obvious enough that they could figure out what you were saying anyway. Now, if you've spoken Chinese with lots of people in lots of different situations and people rarely misunderstand anything, well, your pronunciation probably is okay. But most students haven't had that kind of exposure and that kind of experience with speaking, so it's kind of hard to tell most of the time how good your pronunciation actually is. So that's what I want to address in this episode. I would say that there are two methods available here. The first is the one that I will describe in this episode, and it will allow you to find problems with initials, finals, and tones, and you will be able to find them both in your ability to hear pronunciation, so your perception of Mandarin sounds, and it will also help you find problems with the way you pronounce these sounds, so your own pronunciation, in other words. The other method is to find someone you can trust to give you brutally honest feedback and not cuddle you and not say that your pronunciation is good when in fact it isn't. And this is something that I've worked with quite a lot over the years, and it's also part of my pronunciation course. And I want to mention it here because it will be open for a new round next week. That's September 20th. But if you listen to this later, you will find information on the course page where you can sign up for notifications when the course becomes available again. But anyway, in the course there is an add-on that gives you professional feedback where I go through your pronunciation and give you detailed breakdowns of every single mistake you make. And of course, I also highlight the things that you know well and that you don't need to practice that much. But the most important bit is that I really tell you what things you're doing well, and I do so regardless of your background. So if you study for 10 years or 1 year, you will get the same feedback if you have the same pronunciation. And the idea here is, of course, to help you identify the problems that you have so that you can gradually start working on them. Because if you have problems, it's unlikely that they will fix themselves over time. And this is especially true if you've already been studying for a while. And this is, of course, not related to my course as such. It's just identifying problems with pronunciation in general, using the free method I will explain in a second, or my course is very helpful because it allows you to pay attention to how people say things, and then gradually you will improve the way you say them and then improve. But if you don't do anything, your bad pronunciation will probably cement and get harder and harder to fix. So figuring out where your most serious problems are is important. And if you want to learn more about the pronunciation course, you can go to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. Okay, so what is this ingenious method of discovering problems with Mandarin sounds and tones? Well, it's a fairly simple method that involves what's called minimal pairs. So a minimal pair in phonology is a pair of words that differ only in one phonological element, such as maybe a vowel sound or a tone. So for example, the English words bit and bet form a minimal pair. An example in Chinese would be hao, good, and lao, old. So these are identical except for the initial sound. An example with tones in Mandarin would be mai, to buy something, or mai, to sell. So those are the same, they differ only in the tone. And of course, we don't have to stick to pairs, we can have triplets or quadruplets as well. And you've probably seen at least one of these when you first learned about tones in Mandarin. And in the course, I do explain all the basic stuff about tones, and I use the example ba, 8 for the first tone, ba to pull out for the second tone, and ba, handle for the third tone, and then ba, dad for the fourth tone. So these are 4 words that have different meaning and they differ only in the tone. In fact, we can even have larger sets, but that requires us to use words that don't really exist or to make up words. But I will get to that in a bit. I will stick to the simple 4 tones here, just to give you an example of how this works. So let's look at how you can use this to check your perception of tones and your pronunciation of tones. So the first step is to simply list the tones that you want to check. And we just did that. We have the 4 basic tones. And like I said, this is very basic and very easy for most people, but we will get to tone pairs and other tricky bits later. I just use a very simple example here to make sure it's easy to follow and understand. So we have a list with the syllables that we want to read. And you should make sure that both people are able to see this clearly and can point to it when necessary. Then, to check your perception first, we're going to check listening first, and then we're going to check pronunciation. So let your native speaking friend write down these syllables in random order. And I suggest that they write them twice. You can go with 3 times or whatever you want, but at least twice. So what they will end up with is 8 syllables with 8 tones that are scrambled. So an example here would be ba, 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 ba. So those were all the 8 tones in scrambled order. So your friend has these written down in a way that you cannot see them. You also have them in a common space where you can see just the 4 syllables you're working with, so you can talk about them, but they also write them down in scrambled order, and it's very important that you do not see what they have written. That's crucial. Okay, so next your friend says these words in the order that they have written them, and your goal is to write down what they are saying. And you can do this in any way you want, just using the numbers for the tones or the tone marks or the whole syllable. It doesn't really matter. If they need to read them more than once for clarification, that is fine. That's not a problem. But your goal is to write down what they are saying based only on the way they say it, obviously. Next, you compare your list with your friend's list. Now, obviously, if your listening is good here, you will have a list that is identical to that of your friends, right? But if you have problems with the way you hear and perceive tones, you might find that you have misheard some tones, and that gives you a clue then that something might need more work here. Now, making a single mistake once is not really enough to say that you have a problem with something, but if you do this a few times, you should be able to figure out that, oh, okay, maybe sometimes I think that the second tone is a third tone or something else. Next, we should reverse the roles so that we can analyze and diagnose your pronunciation of the tones. So you write down a list of 8 syllables with 8 different tones in a scrambled order. You say these words, and your friend writes down what you are saying or what they think they are saying. And they usually prefer to do this in characters if they are native speakers, and that of course works. It's just important that it's clear which syllable they are referring to. And then you compare your list, the one you read from, with your friend's list, and you see what they have written. If the lists are exactly the same, then you know that your pronunciation is at least okay. So it might seem that this method is unnecessarily elaborate, but believe me when I say that you really can't trust people to tell you how good your pronunciation is, especially if you just ask them how good your pronunciation is. Now, naturally, if you have a friend who really wants to help you and who is honest and you don't think that they are going to try to trick you into believing that your pronunciation is better than it is, you can use the same method here just without writing things down. So you have the table, you say something, and they point to what they think that you are saying. And of course, here they can't really cheat because they don't know what you intend to say. But you can also do the opposite where they say something and you point. You should also pay attention to your friend's implicit feedback here, i.e., things they are not saying but maybe showing. For example, are they hesitating when they are selecting the tone they think that you are saying? Then that probably means that your tone is not very good, even if they point at the right one. Do they look confused? Do they look like they really struggle to understand what you're saying or pointing to the right word? Well, then maybe your pronunciation isn't that good. Whereas if they point to the right answer confidently and immediately every single time, then this exercise is too easy for you and you're unlikely to find many problems. So let's step it up a bit and make it harder. And here I must warn that this can get very hard very fast. And I actually tried this when teaching once, and I did not expect it to be as difficult as it was. And I did this with people who had studied for, I don't remember exactly, but almost a year full-time at university. And I imagined that their tone pairs were okay. I don't really normally teach these people, otherwise I would obviously have known. This was a kind of extra conversation speaking thing that I did with this class. But it turned out that they found this tone pair exercise extremely difficult, which meant that their tone pairs weren't nearly as good as they should have been. So it could be that you are in this situation too, so I suggest that you don't start with all tone pairs at once. If you go to Hacking Chinese and check out the article that relates to this podcast episode, you can see that I've put tables there for all the tone pairs. And it's pretty simple. You have all the four tones as rows, and then you have all the tones as columns as well, including the neutral tone. So that means if you combine the rows and columns, you'll get 20 cells, and in each cell there is one tone pair. So for example, in the first cell it says tone 1 plus tone 1. So for example, say 飞机, airplane, that's 1 plus 1. And in the bottom right, it's fourth tone plus neutral tone, so maybe 爸爸, as in dad. Naturally, it would be impossible to find 20 words in Mandarin that have exactly the same syllables but with different tones, and that matches all these 20 combinations. That simply doesn't exist. We can maybe find a few. For example, we have things like 老师, teacher, 老师, as in always doing something, and 老实, as in being honest or frankly. But we could never find words that cover the whole table. And here comes the crucial bit. You need to make up words here, and I will show you a few ways of doing this. But first, I will show you why this is the case. You can't just use words that you have studied and slot them into the table, so maybe putting 飞机 in the first cell and 爸爸 in the bottom right cell. That doesn't really work because someone listening to when you say these will be able to point to the right word no matter how bad your tones are. Because what they are answering in this case is not really what tones is this person saying, but which of these words is closest to the sounds that I hear. So even if you pronounced airplane like 飞机, with a fourth tone and then a neutral tone, no one is going to think that you're trying to say dad because, well, it's the same tone pattern, but it's completely different syllables, and no one will think that. They will just think you're trying to say 飞机, but you messed it up. The solution is to use nonsense words, which allows you to ignore context. And normally when we're talking about communication, context is a good thing. It's something we can rely on, and we rely on all the time to understand what's being said. But in this case, to allow us to find specific tone patterns that we have problems with, we need to disregard context because otherwise we don't know if people understand us because of the context or because our pronunciation is actually accurate. I've tried 3 ways of doing this and I've listed them in the order that I think that they are useful. So the default one, the basic one, is to just use a single syllable in Mandarin, preferably an easy one like ba or maybe ma. And then you just add tones, which will create two-syllable constructions that don't really mean anything, but has the tone pattern you want. So maybe ba ba for first tone, or ba ba for third tone, fourth tone. If you think it makes it easier, you can write these syllables in the tables, or you can just use the tables as they are and just use this syllable over and over. Next, you can use a voiced sound of some kind, so a vowel or or something. So you can just say for third tone, second tone. Or you can use or something like that and say ah, and so on. Finally, and this is at least the funniest way of doing it, although I don't think necessarily it's the best one, is to use a word from your native language. So say the word, I don't know, Chinese, and you add tones to it. So you can say Chinese, that would be first tone, first tone. Or if you say third tone, fourth tone, it would be Chinese. Or let's say you have a third tone, second tone, it would be Chinese. This is slightly worse because I think the step for a native speaker of Mandarin to connect this with their own language and their own tones is a little bit further than if you actually use syllables that exist in the language, or sounds that exist at least. So when you've decided on a syllable and so on, I suggest that you select a row or a column in the table. So that would mean, say, starting with tone pairs which begin with the first tone. And then you go through the same procedure as we did with the 4 basic tones earlier in this episode. And then you go to another column or you go to another row and you select different parts of the table that you think you might have problems with. For example, if you know that you find the second tone and third tone difficult, select the cells that have these tones and focus on those only. If you're brave or think that your pronunciation is quite good and you've studied for a while, by all means, use the whole table at once. I've tried this with several different native speakers to verify that it's definitely possible and actually quite easy to get 100% accuracy, assuming that both people have good pronunciation and good perception of tones, of course. However, remember what I said, I tried this with people who had studied Chinese for full time, maybe for 10 months or so, and they did not do very well. I felt very bad about doing that, and I've never used the whole table at once since then, but rather just sections of it first until I'm sure that they can handle all of it, because it really is quite difficult unless you are quite good at tones. Okay, but let's talk about other things than tones. What's the wider usage here? Well, you can of course use exactly this method, minimal pairs or minimal sets, to test anything else. You can use it with aspiration. You just have a columns with, say, B, P, D, T, and so on. And you check that you are able to perceive and pronounce aspiration. You can do it to differentiate, say, S and SH to see if you have the retroflex there. So say sa and sha. You can also do it with nasals, so that would be the difference between an and ang, so with an and ang, for example. If you want to torment your Chinese friends and really check their English, you can also do this with words like world, word, whirl, and whir in English. And Chinese people typically think that these are quite hard to both hear and to pronounce. Of course, no method is perfect, so let's talk a little bit about some problems with using this method to diagnose problems with pronunciation and perception. So, one thing is, of course, that context matters. What this method does is to isolate the tone patterns, if you're using the tone pairs, I mean. And that is not very natural. In a normal sentence, you would have lots more things that support your pronunciation, and even if you have problems with this exercise, you might actually be able to communicate with people most of the time, especially if your grammar is good and you choose the right words and so on. I would say that pronunciation here is a little bit like spelling. So you can, of course, communicate in writing even if your spelling is horrible, and people will generally understand what you want to say anyway. But of course, correctly spelled text is much, much easier to read. And similarly, Mandarin that is pronounced correctly is much easier to perceive and understand for native speakers. And if you have lots of other problems with, say, word order, the problems just compound and it will be quite difficult to understand what you're saying. Another problem with this method is that it's not really a good way to practice tones necessarily. It's more a way to assess and check how good your tones are, or your pronunciation in general. Whereas if you want to improve your pronunciation once you know what the problem is, I don't think that this method is what you should use. You should simply listen more and pay attention to those areas you know you have problems with, and you should mimic a lot. And then after a while you can do a check like this again to see, okay, does my friend find it easier to understand me now? The method is also slightly limited in the sense that it only works for small phonological features of certain syllables. You can't really use it for checking, say, prosody or overall comprehensibility or something like that. Finally, I would also like to highlight a potential problem with the speaking aspect of this exercise, and that is that your friend might be able to say which tone you're trying to say, even though you're wrong. And that is because, in essence, they are faced with a multiple choice question and they only need to choose which one is closest to what you're saying. So, for example, let's imagine that you think that the first tone is really high and really long. I mean, it is high and flat, but it's not super long. But let's say you thought it were. So you would say something like ma. And of course, I would guess that you are saying a first tone here. It's certainly not a fourth tone, right? But that doesn't mean that this is a first tone that is actually good. This is not how you pronounce it normally, and this is not what you should practice either. It's not really indicative of how good your first tones are in general. The same might happen if you think that the fourth tone is very short and very aggressive, even though it of course isn't. And that doesn't really mean that your fourth tones are good just because someone can identify them. And here you really need other methods to figure out how good your pronunciation is. And like I said, the pronunciation course is one way of doing that, and it opens for registration next week. In the meantime, or if you're not interested in the course for some reason, you can always use the method I have talked about in this episode to figure out what your problems are when it comes to perceiving and pronouncing Mandarin sounds and tones. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.